The cat arrived on a morning that felt exactly like all the others. Over the small town, the sky hung in a flat, heavy layer of cloud. It was the kind of weather that erased the border between early and late. Everything looked like the same slow hour. Nurses walked in with travel mugs and tired eyes. A maintenance worker fought again with a stubborn side door. In the kitchen, someone cracked eggs, measured coffee, and silently counted how many shifts still stood between this day and a real rest. The nursing home stood at the edge of town, just past the last gas station, just before the fields began. It was not beautiful, and it was not ugly. It was simply there. A low, practical building with brick, vinyl siding, and windows that all seemed a little too similar from the outside. In brochures, it was called a care facility. In everyday speech, it was called the home. For many of the people inside, it had quietly become the last address they would ever memorize. Inside, the smells never really changed. Disinfectant, old coffee, laundry detergent that tried very hard to smell like flowers and never quite succeeded. The corridors were narrow but clean. The art on the walls showed sunsets and mountains that no one here would see again except through glass and memory. Machines hummed and beeped. Televisions murmured through thin walls. Wheels of carts squeaked on the floor. The building carried its routine like a second skin. Near the center of the main corridor, there was a window that did not match the others. It was wider by just enough to be noticeable. No one still working there could say exactly why. Some staff insisted that an architect had misread a measurement long ago. Others claimed a former director had wanted one bright place in that stretch of hall. Over the years, whatever the original reason had been, the window had turned into a quiet landmark. Family members leaned against its sill while waiting for doctors. Nurses paused there for a single calm breath between alarms. Wheelchairs rolled past that bright square of glass like slow boats crossing a shallow band of sun. On that particular morning, the wide window did its usual work, letting a thin, washed-out light fall into the corridor. The day shift wound itself up in the usual way. Call buttons chimed. Pill cups rattled. Somewhere a television announced news from places these residents would never visit. No one noticed the exact moment when the cat appeared. Later, people tried to remember. They tried to picture it crossing the parking lot, weaving through hedges, slipping past the automatic doors while someone signed a visitor log. No one could. When they looked back, the cat simply existed, as if the building had grown it overnight. It sat on the wide sill of the big window, gray fur pressed flat where its weight met painted wood. The tail curled neatly around its front paws. Its eyes were half closed, not in sleep, but in that heavy, comfortable awareness that cats carry when they are entirely sure of their place. The fur was short and dense, in several shades of gray. A small white patch marked the chest. Around the neck and the coat, there was a faint pale groove that hinted at a collar that no longer existed. The first person who truly registered that something was different was a man from housekeeping. He pushed his cart with folded towels, bottles, and a mop that rattled against its handle at every bump in the floor. As he rounded the bend near the big window, the cart wheels squeaked, and the cat opened its eyes. For a brief moment, there was a silent exchange. The man saw an ordinary animal, but in that ordinary body, something felt exactly right in the space. The animal did not look lost. It did not try to hide. It did not throw itself toward the door as if desperate to escape. It simply occupied the sill as if that spot had always been meant for it. Outside, the clouds thinned for a heartbeat, and a narrow line of sunlight slipped through the glass. It landed precisely on the cat's shoulders, covering the gray fur in a wash of pale gold. Each hair seemed to separate and glow on its own. The sill, usually dull, acquired a soft, almost intentional brightness. The housekeeper stood there a little longer than his schedule allowed. He felt something inside his chest unclench by a fraction, though he could not have named what it was. There were trash bags to change, floors to mop, laundry bins to empty. After one beat too long, he pushed his cart forward, leaving the cat and the light behind him in the corridor. The cat remained where it was. It looked down the hall with that unblinking patience that belongs only to creatures who have never been taught to hurry. Beds rolled past. Nurses moved quickly and quietly in their soft shoes, eyes on screens and charts. In one room, someone coughed. In another, an oxygen machine exhaled and inhaled, steady and mechanical. Somewhere, a weather report filtered out from an unseen television, describing storms in a distant part of the country. By the middle of the morning, the sun climbed higher behind the cloud cover. On a normal day, light from that wide window would have flooded a long stripe of corridor, forcing anyone pushing a cart to squint and complain. This time, the light behaved differently. It seemed to concentrate itself, as if the glass had turned into a lens and the cat into the point where light decided what to do. The brightest part of the beam settled on the cat, then spilled across the floor and into one room directly opposite the window. That room belonged to a woman named Martha. Her chart at the door carried a long, formal name, a list of diagnoses, and a careful schedule of pills. In staff conversations, she had become the woman in the corner room who rarely spoke. Long before this place, she had spent her life in the town post office. She had handled envelopes for decades, learned addresses the way other people learned prayers, watched families grow and scatter through the names on mailboxes. Life had bent her slowly. A husband lost too soon. A son who drifted away and did not quite return. A daughter who stayed close, but not always close enough to reach certain parts of the past. A fall in the kitchen had brought her here, where days were measured in doses and visits, and the steady rise and fall on screens. On that first morning with the cat, the sunlight reached into Martha's room with an unusual intensity. It drew a bright rectangle across the end of the bed, climbed the wall, and settled on her face where she lay propped by pillows. For the first time in several days, she shifted before anyone touched her. Her eyelids lifted a fraction earlier than usual. Her breathing, for a while, found a deeper rhythm. The monitor beside her bed displayed a pattern that, if anyone had compared it carefully to previous days, would have looked just a little smoother. No one made the connection yet. The cat came back the next day, and the day after that. It never arrived with ceremony. It never scratched at doors or cried at the glass. It simply appeared as if it had always been scheduled to be there. Some mornings the fur looked slightly damp, as if from a light mist, but the animal never looked bedraggled. It never showed signs of hunger sharp enough to cause alarm. The staff began to assume that someone in the neighborhood fed it after hours, or that it hunted well enough on its own. No one could say for sure. Each morning, the cat chose a different position by the wide window. Sometimes it sat on the sill itself. Sometimes it curled on the warm floor, where the light pooled. Sometimes it stretched long and narrow, with its back pressed to the frame. Wherever the cat decided to settle, the brightest part of the sunbeam followed. And the sunbeam chose a room. The change was subtle at first. The corridor outside stayed in a comfortable half-shadow, easy on older eyes and tired nurses. Only one doorway at a time seemed to drink in the strongest warmth. That room glowed in a way the others did not. The air felt different there, softer, less metallic. In one of those early days, the chosen room belonged to a retired machinist who had been sleeping in short, restless spurts for weeks. That morning, his bed lay inside the golden strip. He slept for a long stretch, without frowning, without clutching at the sheets. A nurse entering for the midday round found him breathing in slow, even waves, hands open on the blanket. She noted the numbers on his chart and, without knowing exactly why, allowed herself a small exhale. Another day, the light concentrated on a room that had been occupied only a few weeks earlier by a new resident, a former librarian who had drifted in and out of confusion. She had boxes of unsorted photographs and letters stacked in her closet. Her niece had been postponing the work of sorting through them, afraid of what they might stir. On the morning when the cat chose that window, the niece arrived unexpectedly early. She stood in the sunlit part of the room and, for the first time, opened the closet door without feeling overwhelmed. That afternoon, the box of photos finally moved to the table, and the two women spent hours piecing together faces and names before the last strength of the older mind faded again. The pattern did not announce itself with trumpets. It grew in small, overlapping observations. A nurse noticed that the room with the brightest light often had calmer, vital signs. A housekeeper realized that the residents who received that beam sometimes asked for fewer pain pills. The night shift exchanged stories about how, on days after the light visited a particular room, the alarms from that bed seemed slightly less insistent. One of the people who tried hardest to stay practical was a nurse named Jolene. She had been in this building long enough to see many strange coincidences and quiet endings. She prided herself on keeping both feet on the solid floor of medicine and routine. Even so, curiosity nudged her. On an old clipboard, she drew a simple rectangle for the hall and marked each doorway with a letter. Each morning, when she saw the cat at the window, she noted where it sat and which room received the strongest beam. Later, during rounds, she added quick notes from memory. Slept better. Ate more at breakfast. Asked for a phone call. Finally, rested. The list gathered ink. One day, the cat settled in such a way that the sunlight fell into the room of a former school principal. He had always insisted on sitting up straight, as long as his spine allowed it. He corrected pronunciation on television ads. He counted pills himself whenever anyone handed him a cup. Old disappointments sat in his chest like heavy stones. There were children out in the world whom he loved fiercely and resented almost as fiercely. On that particular morning, the light touched his bedside table, where a phone lay face down under a magazine. It warmed the plastic. It crossed his hands. Something in the tone of his own heartbeat changed as he watched the line of brightness inch up the blanket. Later that day, staff saw him making calls he had avoided for years. No one listened in, but they noticed that the lines of his face arranged themselves differently when he hung up. Less like a mask, more like a person who had put something back in its proper place. In another room, on another day, the light fell over a former nurse. Her own working years had been spent in sharp uniforms and harsh white. She had known this kind of building when she was the one standing beside the bed instead of lying in it. For weeks, she had drifted through a fog of confusion, grabbing at bits of reality and losing them again. On the morning when the cat sat still and the sun angled into her doorway, something in her awareness cleared. She reached for a notepad. Hands that trembled most days moved with surprising purpose. Staff later found a page of shaky but precise instructions about documents, keys, and an old recipe book. After that day, she relaxed, as if some invisible knot had finally loosened. Not every story attached to the light was dramatic. Sometimes the difference was only that a very tired aide allowed herself to sit for a slow count of 20 beside a bed she usually rushed past. Sometimes a family visit coincided with a beam of sun across a chair, and the conversation somehow avoided the usual loop of weather and television and found another subject for a while. Sometimes nothing obvious happened at all, and the notes on the clipboard remained blank for that room, but the resident still spent that day in a softer mood that no one could fully attribute to anything. Through all of this, the cat did nothing remarkable. It stretched, it curled, it washed its paws with rough pink tongue. It blinked at people passing by. It accepted the occasional saucer of food or tidbit left on the sill, but never begged. It never scratched. It never hissed. If someone tried to pick it up and carry it elsewhere, it simply detached itself and returned to its chosen spot with patient insistence. The building adjusted around it. Staff stepped around the animal rather than over it. Carts slowed down near the wide window. Even the usually impatient delivery drivers seemed to lower their voices when they walked past that part of the corridor. No one made a formal rule about any of it, yet a shared understanding grew all the same. The residents began to talk among themselves in their own ways. Some awaited the cat as if waiting for a visitor whose name they had forgotten, but whose presence they still recognized. Some pretended not to care and then watched the shaft of light in the corridor with quiet intensity. For many, the idea formed that the cat was granting sessions of extra mourning, handing out pockets of time and warmth to rooms that most needed it on a given day. There came a morning when the wide sill was empty. The light fell flat and wide into the corridor, as it had in the years before. It reached no particular room with special focus. Staff walked past with coffee cups and charts, and a thin anxiety began to drift through conversations. Someone asked whether the animal might have finally wandered off for good. Someone else suggested that perhaps it belonged to a family that had moved away. A few pretended not to notice its absence at all. That day felt heavier than the sky above it really justified. The next morning, long before the earliest nurse had clocked in, the night security camera caught a small gray shape slipping along the outside wall and hopping up to the window. By the time the first cart rolled past, the cat was back on the sill, fur catching the first usable light of the day. The anxiety released itself in quiet ways. Shoulders lowered. Jokes returned. The empty day became an exception in memories instead of the start of an ending. As the weeks unfolded, the link between the animal, the sunlight, and the chosen rooms grew stronger in the minds of those who lived and worked there. The pattern never became perfectly predictable, and perhaps that was part of its power. The cat did not respond to requests. It did not come to the rooms where hope was loudest or where fear made the most noise. Its choices seemed to follow a path drawn with lines no human hand could see. In a room near the far end of the corridor lived a man who had spent his life in factories and repair shops. His hands, even now, bore the record of that work in scars and old stains. For many nights he lay tense, wrists rigid, as if still holding tools that were no longer there. On the morning when the light finally singled out his doorway, his fist loosened. The muscles in his forearms softened. Later that day, he allowed someone to hold his fingers for a few minutes without pulling away. To outsiders, that might have looked small. In the quiet logic of the building, it felt like another stone removed from a dam inside a human heart. In another corner room, a pair of siblings, now both elderly, had carried an unspoken argument for decades. One had moved away as a young adult, convinced that leaving was a kind of survival. The other had stayed, convinced that staying was the same thing. Their visits at the home had been stiff, full of half-sentences and weather updates. On a day when the beam of light fell between their two chairs, they found themselves speaking of a memory that lay at the root of their distance. The machines in the room continued their calm blinking and beeping. Staff passing in the hall felt a slight change in the air pressure, as if a long-closed door had opened somewhere very deep. The cat remained the same. It never hurried. It never seemed late. Its body was simply present wherever the sun needed a starting point. To the practical mind, it was only an animal seeking the warmest spot in a building that offered many cooler ones. To the people whose lives had narrowed to these rooms and hallways, it became something else, even if no one could define exactly what. Jolene kept adding small marks to her clipboard. Sometimes her notes were factual: heart rate steady, ate full breakfast, less pain medication. Sometimes they were only impressions. Peaceful. Finally said what needed to be said. Rested. She did not share that sheet with the director. She did not put it into the official records. It felt like something separate from charts and forms, a different kind of accounting. Outside, the seasons shifted. Leaves traded green for dull color and then for bare branches. Rain tapped on the windows. Ice traced thin lines along the edges of the parking lot. Through all of it, as long as the sun existed somewhere beyond the cloud cover, light continued to find the cat, and then, through the cat, to find a single room inside the building. On days when there were sudden declines, the pattern did not stop. In one room, late on a winter afternoon, the light came in thin and cold, but still enough to mark out a path across the floor. The resident there lay very near the end of their measured time. Breathing was shallow. Monitors were gentle but insistent. Family members stood at the edges of the bed and did not know what to do with their hands. The sunlight reached their faces as well as the person in the bed. It gave each of them a little more clarity about the fact that this, too, was part of a life, not only its failure. The machines did not perform any sudden miracles. The monitors did not flatten into impossible recoveries. What did change was the quality of the last hours: less panic, more presence. In that sense, the pattern of the cat and the light was never about rescue in the dramatic sense. It was about something quieter, more ordinary, and therefore, in some ways, more powerful. It was about one more chance, one more sentence completed, one more name spoken aloud, one more small knot untied in a place where time was mostly occupied with endings. No one ever discovered where the cat came from. No collar appeared. No flyer went up on a telephone pole asking for its return. The town outside the nursing home continued with its own rhythms of work and school and grocery runs. Somewhere, there were people who might have recognized the shape of the gray body and the pattern of the white on its chest. But if they existed, they never came through the doors looking for it. Inside, the animal simply became part of the building. When new staff joined the team, someone eventually mentioned the cat in a casual tone, as if explaining where the extra blankets were kept or which cart had the stubborn wheel. They were told that the animal liked the wide window, that the light followed it, that certain rooms seemed to feel better on days when the fur at the sill glowed brightest. Some newcomers laughed. Some nodded politely and tucked the story away. Many of them, after their first long shift, found themselves drifting toward that window at the end of the day without quite meaning to. From the outside, the home continued to look like any other. Brick, siding, standard windows, a sign with a name that could have belonged to any facility in any small town. Drivers passed it on their way to work, barely noticing the wide pane of glass where a cat sometimes sat in the morning sun. From the inside, for those who lived and worked there, the wide window became something different. It was not just glass. It was a doorway through which each chosen day a small, ordinary animal seemed to hand out light, and with that light, a little more time, a little more peace, to whichever room needed it most. The records of the building would never show it. Charts would list medications, lab results, blood pressure readings. Reports would speak of budgets and repairs and staffing levels. None of those lines would mention the gray cat. And yet, if someone asked the residents, the nurses, the aides, the housekeepers, and they answered honestly, many of them would remember that period of years not by the numbers in their folders, but by a simpler image. They would remember a wide window, a beam of sunlight that never fell quite the same way twice, and a quiet gray cat that seemed to know better than anyone else which room deserved the morning.